Hello and welcome back to Ruben Uncut. Today, we're going to do some history. We'll be talking about somebody from history. That's what I mean by that. And specifically, comic book history. And that person is the creator of Wonder Woman, William Moulton Marston, which is honestly a mouthful. So why do I find William Moulton Marston so interesting? Well, because he's an interesting guy. Now, when he wrote Wonder Woman, he wrote it under the pen name of Charles Moulton, you know, probably because that he was, sort of fired, sort of kind of disgracefully at the time. You see, because William Moulton Marston, or Professor Marston, if you will, was ahead of his time, not necessarily in his psychological theories, but in the way that he lived his life. You see, one, William Moulton Marston, was married to his wife, Elizabeth Holloway Marston, but they also shared a polyamorous life partner, Olive Byrne. Now, according to the movie based on his life, the character of Wonder Woman is actually essentially a facsimile of the two women he was in a relationship with. Now, I want to be clear, this was a complete triangle. Both him and his wife were dating Olive. Now, the thing about this is that, let's see what year did he get fired for that? He had previously worked for the American University, Tufts University, where he would be, and I'm having trouble finding the date here, but he would ultimately be fired when the fact that he was in an unnatural relationship would come to light. Now, the thing about him is that he's famous for more than just Wonder Woman. In fact, let's talk a little bit more about the man himself before I jump into Wonder Woman and his creation of Wonder Woman. Because you see, my basic takeaway here is that if Mr. Marston had been writing comic books today, he would almost certainly be referred to as woke. And his comic books would be referred to as woke propaganda, which is not actually totally unfair. But once again, getting ahead of myself. Why did I even want to talk about this? Well, let me tell you. The other day, I saw an interview with comic book writer Tom King, who wrote some excellent Batman comics, by the way. And and yes, that one comic book had a great idea, but was ultimately super flawed. I'm talking about Heroes in Crisis. But anyways, where was I? But Tom King in this interview stated about how it was difficult to write Wonder Woman, because right now he's relaunching Wonder Woman, I think. And he was talking about the difficulties of trying to bring life back to this character when the creator had sort of based them in his sort of kinks, as it were. And now there's a thing that Tom King said in the interview, but I couldn't help but feel like Tom King wasn't giving the full picture or context of what that means, because it's not untrue, but you have to hear the whole context, okay? Okay, we're going to go into the whole context. So Professor Marston, he's famous for a lot of things, including his theories of psychology, his advocacy for women, and of course, the systolic blood pressure test, also known as the lie detector. He was one of the guys who invented that, or at least came up with the concept of the systolic blood pressure test to check if people were lying. Now, I'm not here to talk about the things that are or are not true about lie detector tests and why they're not necessarily great evidence. There are some flaws with it, but at the time, the concept was sound, and it, for the most part, seemed to be able to tell when people were not telling the truth. Now, unfortunately for Professor Marston, He didn't believe in patents. So he missed out. Other people's names got to be on the invention besides him, and other people made more money, which is tragic for him because he probably could have used the money later on. Now, Professor Marston, and by the way, I'm gonna put a picture of this guy in the podcast because you got to see what this guy looks like. I'm impressed that he managed to attract the attention of more than one woman. He's not nearly as good looking as he is in the movie. He looks more standard white guy from the 30s than that. He apparently also wrote the script for the movie The Thief, which was directed by Alice Guy Blaché in 1913. Where was I? Right. So anyways, William Moulton Marston had a very interesting psychological theory. You see, William Moulton Marston's theories on psychology sort of goes along like this. Essentially, he believed that human beings wanted to essentially be led, that we wanted someone to come in and sort of take the reins. However, we also want to have a say in that situation. And how he broke it down is essentially there was the domination, there was submission, and there was compliance. The domination, of course, is the person in charge, the person who makes the decisions, the person who. Now, the submissive is, of course, the submissive is someone, and this is important because this is an important part of his theory right here, is the difference between submission and compliance. Submission, according to Mr. Marston's theories, submission is a choice. If you submit to someone, that means that you want to be there in that position. However, if you are only compliant, that's bad. People don't want to be compliant. Compliant is when you're forced to go along with something you really don't want to be taking part in. If this sounded a lot like bondage, it does in fact sound a lot like bondage. In fact, the whole deal is that eventually William Moulton Marston found out about bondage, and it was like a light bulb went off in his head, and he was like, oh my God, this is the perfect way to explain my psychological theories with bondage. Because his psychological theories lined up with bondage really, really well. Why am I bringing this up? Because it's part of the influences for Wonder Woman. Now, what are the other influences for Wonder Woman? Well, a big one, of course, is feminism. You see, William Moulton Marston was a feminist. Yeah, that's right, male feminist in like the early 20th century. And he believed that it was important for more men to understand the potential of women and essentially their equality. In fact, he once wrote an article for a journal called Women Can Outthink Men, which, I don't know, maybe that's my last podcast was about pearly things and all the ridiculous stuff she believes about women. Maybe she knew, maybe she thought, maybe this is what she was talking about. Maybe this is the idea. Well, I mean, thanks to IQ tests, we now know this isn't true. We now know that men and women are actually relatively within the same range when it comes to intelligence on average. But he did write an article called Women Can Outthink Men. Take from that what you will. Early 20th century psychology, not the most ethical. Not that I've ever saying I've heard of him doing anything unethical, although him having two wives was considered unethical at the time. Now, so where are we at? We've got two wives, lie detector test, feminism, and wait, did I say the bondage? Because the bondage. What do all these things add up to? Well, the answer is Wonder Woman. Like I said before, Wonder Woman was in fact a facsimile of the two women he loved, basically combining the traits of both of them that made him love them into one woman, as it were. And then he set that one woman on an idyllic, woman-run Amazon island, paradise, a utopia, if you will, where there are no men. Now, in the story, Wonder Woman, once a man lands on the island, decides that she wants to go off into the world and essentially bring the utopian values of her feminist island to the world. Now, in the original comic book context, there's a little contest, and the queen of the island doesn't want Wonder Woman to go. So Wonder Woman disguises herself and wins the contest and the right to go to the world of men. So she gets in her invisible jet, which I don't know where that came from, but maybe it was just something he thought was cool. And she took her lasso of truth, that when people were tied with it, they could not tell a lie, lie detector test, to go to the world and spread her message of women's empowerment. Now, in the comics, part of this is sort of necessitated by her encounter with one Steve Trevor, who is sort of like, how should I put this? He's sort of like the Mansell in distress a lot. So that's like where he comes in. Essentially, he took the standard idea of comics like Superman and whatnot, of them having this woman who's in love with them and etc., and he flips it on its head so that it's now a military man. So Wonder Woman arrives in America and becomes an agent for the state, fighting crime and defending America and trying to bring the women's values to them. And that part of bringing women's values to them, that's legitimately part of why he made the comics. On the subject of why he created Wonder Woman, Mr. Marston has given out essentially two basic answers. One is that he felt like it was important for there to be a woman hero for girls to look up to, but also because he thought it was the perfect way to teach young boys about feminism. I am 100% not shitting you. Now, honestly, this sounds like the part of the story where Ben Shapiro would start complaining about what a freakish degenerate Mr. Marston was. However, I think Mr. Marston's story is beautiful, and I highly recommend the movie on his life. It won I can't remember if it was won or was nominated for a GLAAD award. It's a good movie, though. I do recommend it. Now, another part of it, though, is that even though Steve Trevor is this romantic interest for Wonder Woman, it's kind of made clear to us throughout the comics that she doesn't actually need him. Now, Wonder Woman would be, through the years, reorganized, and her levels of feminism would be turned up and down throughout. And at one point in the 70s, they even took away her powers and made her fight criminals with kung fu, which, like, fucking 70s, man. Fucking 70s. I think it was the 70s. It might have been the 60s. There was a dark period in that area for Wonder Woman, is what I'm saying. In fact, the TV show probably brought her powers back. That was probably part of what happened there. I'm off topic. That's not important. We're talking about Mr. Marston, the creator of Wonder Woman. Where was I? Right, so she's working for the United States government, solving crimes, helping with the war effort against the Nazis, fighting evil dwarf hypnotists called Dr. Psycho. A lot of stuff going on. There's another thing that I haven't said about Wonder Woman that ties in to one of the other things I hadn't said, that I said earlier, which was the bondage. How does the bondage thing relate to Wonder Woman? Well, beyond just the, lasso of truth element, where she can basically control people who are tied up with it, Wonder Woman's original weakness, The only way to take away her powers was for her to be bound by a man. And I do mean literally bound, like tied up. This was her kryptonite, her book of matches. That's a Martian Manhunter reference for anyone who doesn't know. This was her weakness. Now, over the years, this stopped being Wonder Woman's weakness for, I think, pretty obvious reasons. Yeah, pretty obvious reasons. But it's worth noting that Mr. Marston wasn't exactly subtle about any of this. In fact, the publishers at the comics company that he worked for, which would later be essentially merged into DC Comics, they would be like, "Hey, stop it with the bondage stuff in this comic for children." And Mr. Marston was like, "No." And so he would write even bondager scenes into the comic, no matter how many readers complained. Now, it's worth noting that back in his day, Wonder Woman did dress more modestly. She actually started out with a skirt that became shorts. And I'm not exactly sure when it became the one-piece bathing suit look, but everybody's basically fine with it, I guess. It's worth noting his wife was also I should have mentioned this earlier. His wife Elizabeth was also a professor of psychology. In fact, I think they had different theories. So, this is interesting. Okay, so the thing I forgot to mention is that let me give you a more detailed version of his actual psychological theory, because I dramatically oversimplified it here, because he wrote about his theories in a book called Emotions of Normal People, which elaborated on his disc theory. Marston viewed people behaving along two axes with their attention being either passive or active, depending on the individual's perception of his or her environment as either favorable or antagonistic. By placing the axes at right angles, 4 quadrants from each other, describing behavioral patterns. Dominance produces activity in an antagonistic environment. Inducement produces activity in a favorable environment. Submission produces passivity in a favorable environment, and compliance produces passivity in an antagonistic environment. I forgot about inducement. That's the big one I forgot. So dominance and inducement are the two modes for either getting someone to be submissive or compliant. And a whole part of Marston's belief that women would make better leaders than men was that women were better at inducement, and men basically tried to do everything via dominance. I always forget the inducement. It's like one of the most important parts. The book also had a defense of many sexual taboos, using much of Burns' original research she had done for her doctorate. He dedicated the work to her, his mother, his aunt, and Huntley. Wait a minute, who is Huntley? I forget who Huntley is. Well, the point is he dedicated it to her. Moving along. His book sadly received almost no attention from the rest of the academic community, other than a review written by his wife, Byrne, under an alternate name. Oh, I'm sorry. His polyamorous lover, Byrne, who wrote it under an alternate name, Olive Richard. Oh, and here's another thing. So let's talk about Wonder Woman for a minute. Wonder Woman's actual original name was Suprema the Wonder Woman. This was replaced later just by Wonder Woman, which was a popular term at the time that described women who were exceptionally gifted, according to Wikipedia. Wonder Woman first appeared in All-Star Comics number 8, December 1941. Wonder Woman next appeared in Sensation Comics number 1, January 1942. And 6 months later, Wonder Woman number 1 debuted. Fun fact about that is that Wonder Woman has been in continuous print with an exception of 4 months in 1986. The stories were initially written by Marston and illustrated by newspaper artist Harry Peter. Giggle as much as you feel necessary. During his life, Marston had written many articles and books on various psychological topics, but his last 6 years of writing were devoted to his comic creation. Now, according to Wikipedia, one of the purposes, let me read you this about some more things that let me read you this thing that William Marston, so this is from Wikipedia and includes I believe, a quote from him. It has citation, so I trust it. But let's get into this. Marston's Wonder Woman is an early example of bondage themes that were entering popular culture in the 1930s. That's right. That's right. You think bondage is hip and cool? We've been doing it since the 30s. Physical and mental submission appears again and again throughout Marston's comics works, with Wonder Woman and her criminal opponents frequently being tied up or otherwise restrained, and her Amazonian sisters engaging in frequent wrestling and bondage play. These elements were softened by later writers of the series who dropped such characters as the Nazi-like blonde female slaver Eviless completely, despite her having formed the original villainy Inc. of Wonder Woman's enemies. Though Marston had described female nature as being more capable of submissive emotion, in his other writings and interviews, he referred to submission as a noble practice. He did not shy away from sexual implications, saying, "The only hope for peace is to teach people who are full of pep and unbound force to enjoy being bound. Only when the control of self by others is more pleasant than the unbound assertions of self in human relationships can we hope for a stable, peaceful human society. Giving to others, being controlled by them, submitting to other people cannot possibly be enjoyable without a strong erotic element." That's the quote, people. One of the purposes of these bondage depictions was to induce eroticism in readers as a part of what he called sex love training. Through his Wonder Woman comics, he aimed to condition readers to become more readily accepting of loving submission to loving authorities rather than being so assertive with their own destructive egos. About male readers, he later wrote, "Give them an alluring woman stronger than themselves to submit to, and they'll be proud to become her willing slaves." That's right, he predicted simps. Marston combined these themes with others, including restorative and transformative justice, rehabilitation, regret, and their roles in civilization. These appeared often in his depictions of the near-ideal Amazon civilization of Paradise Island, and especially its Reform Island penal colony, which played a central role in many stories and was the loving alternative to retributive justice of the world run by men. These themes are particularly evident in his last story, in which prisoners freed by Eviless, who have responded to Amazonian rehabilitation and now have good dominant submission, stop her and restore the Amazons to power. Some of these themes continued on in the Silver Age characters who might have been influenced by Marston, notably Saturn Girl and Saturn Queen, who, like Eviless and her female army, are also from Saturn, and are also clad in tight, dark red bodysuits, and are also blonde or red-haired, and also have telepathic powers. Wonder Woman's golden lasso of truth, and in particular one of the Amazon Queen's scions of the girdle of Aphrodite. Yes, there's she had a item called the girdle of Aphrodite, or Venus, which Marston first fictionally encountered as Wonder Woman's magic girdle of Aphrodite, then reaching back to its origins, called her golden girdle of Gaia, where the focus of many of the early stories have the same capability to reform people for good in the short term. That's Transformation Island and prolonged wearing of Venus girdles offered in the longer term. The Venus girdle was an analogy for Marston's theory of sex love training, where people can be trained to embrace submission through eroticism. So, like, there's a lot to unpack there. He was a complex guy. He was a very, very complex guy. The thing about William Moulton Marston that blows my mind nowadays is that when people sit around and talk about how woke everything in our society is, and oh, they're trying to influence the youth, William Moulton Marston back in the 1940s is like the only person I can even think of who was actually that thing. He was actually a feminist. He was actually trying to spread propaganda through comic books. And he ultimately used those things to create Wonder Woman, which is honestly wild. It's very wild. He was inducted into the Comic Book Hall of Fame in 2006, which actually seems like took. I don't know when the Comic Book Hall of Fame opened. Oh, actually, I can click on that. Oh, no, that's just. When is it? Oh, okay, I see dates as early as 1992. Oh, those are awards. I don't know. Okay, it looks like it's been around since at least the 90s or 80s. The point is that you'd think you'd think they would have put him in there sooner, you know? Of course, eventually everybody dies. Now, I personally think this guy's pretty cool. Not gonna lie. I don't think I can get. I don't necessarily know if I agree with everything he has to say, and you know, it slowly introducing young people to bondage is that's a little weird. It's a little weird, but you know, it's back in the back in the 40s. You know, teenagers were almost adults. Let's talk a little bit more about him and his wife and their lover. Now, ultimately, what happened is that they would be fired from the university where they worked. And of course, he would become a comic book writer, and Elizabeth would get a job. And ultimately, him and Elizabeth would both work, and Olive would stay home with the kids, which ultimately, between both her and Elizabeth, they ultimately had 4 children. Oh, I just found it. I just found who Marjorie Wilkes Huntley was. She was the third woman, a third woman who occasionally lived with them and who would go on to become office executive under H.G. Peters. I wonder if that's the same Harry Peters I read about before. I don't know. Maybe there was a 4-way in there. But yeah, no, he had 2 children with both Elizabeth and Olive. So this has been basically a brief summary of a guy I think is pretty interesting. However, all stories come to an end. William Moulton Marston died of cancer on May 2nd, 1947, in Rye. 7 days before his 54th birthday. After his death, Elizabeth and Olive continued to live together until Olive's death in 1990 at age 86. Elizabeth died in 1993, age 100. In 1985, Marston was posthumous. I can say this word when I am not trying to read it. Posthumous. After he was dead, he was named as one of the honorees by DC Comics in the company's 5th anniversary publication, 50 Who Made DC Great. His contributions to the development of the polygraph are featured in the documentary film The Lie Detector, which was first aired on The American Experience, January 3rd, 2020. Oh, that just happened. All right. So anyways, I just really wanted to talk about this guy, who I think is very interesting. Like I said, I was prompted by that article I saw the other day. So I hope you found this entertaining, or at least an interesting bit of trivia, if you will. So thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe, or if you're on Spotify, review review the episode. Apparently, that's a thing you can do on Spotify. I don't know. Does anyone Does anyone use the non just listening to stuff on Spotify? I honestly don't know. I know I don't. But anything you can do to help me in the algorithms of these various places would be great. Also, check out the YouTube. Unless you're watching on you get the idea. You can email me at rubenuncut@gmail.com. Yeah. Have a wonderful whatever.